When I found out I was going to be preaching my first sermon, I was understandably a little nervous. To give you a little history of my church speaking, I started off in 1998 working at a church in Athens, Texas. I was asked to give the offertory prayer, and it was my first time I'd ever spoken, so I wrote out this prayer. It's about 4 lines, and I was just so excited. This was going to be my debut, my ministry. And so the preacher sits down, he concludes what he's saying, and I get up there and I say, let's bow, and I read my 4-line prayer, and I look up, and in that time, there's a lot of things happening in that prayer. The ushers are supposed to come down and be able to get the baskets for the offertory. The music minister is supposed to make his way and get the choir ready. But when I look up from my prayer, I realize that the ushers haven't even had time to move. The music minister is still down in the front, hasn't even had time. So there was an awkward pause where the music minister had to walk on the stage, walk by me, and I'm just sitting here petrified. But in all honesty, that's 50 times better than the next time that I was called to speak. The next time was in a small church in Austin that I was serving as the youth pastor there. And this one I was called to read the scripture. And the pastor gives me the scripture 2 minutes before he's going up to tell me. Luckily, no one I knew was in this church, because I get up there and I'm gripping the podium and I'm just sitting there. Okay, I'm going to read this Old Testament, of course, a lot of long names. And as I start to read it, nothing comes out. I literally, my throat dried up, and I was stuck reading the scripture, petrified, looking out at all these people who were more scared than I was. This big, what's he doing? And then I feel the pastor come up. His name was Gordon Bergstrom. Puts his arm on me and he's laughing. And I literally got through two lines maybe of 5 verses, and he just kind of puts his arm on me and walks me back to the seat. And then he whispers in my ear, I'll never forget, he whispers in, he goes, "This happens to all of us, just not in front of 100 people." But anyway, through that experience, I did learn a lot through that experience. I do have a cup of water hidden away over here, and I might be running to it. If I do, then y'all are with me. So, but seriously, as I felt the call to preach, I look back on these experiences, and even though they petrified me at the time, I can honestly say that I see their purpose now. I see that even if it's just the fact I know how to have a glass of water, I know that, man, my ministry is not quite as powerful as I thought it was because I was a little too focused on me. I learned a lot of things from these experiences. And so when I was drawn to this text because of the phrase, looking through the eyes of faith. And so I'm going to just go back over what was happening in this time in the text. And there was a place called Aram, and they decided to wage war on Israel. But this war wasn't going to be the same war. It wasn't the season for war where we're going to go out and we're going to fight battles for land and then go back to our lives and plant our crops. This was going to be a different type of war. This was going to be a subtle war. This was going to be a series of raids, a series of just small attacks that the king of Aram decided. It was going to be the kind of war that when parents had children playing just out front, that they would in the back of their mind be, "Are my children okay?" It was that kind of war. It was terrorism. It was a very fearful war because it did not only focus on armies, it focused on villages, it focused on people. And so the king of Aram begins to make these small raids. As he's making these raids, he notices that Israel's not there. Israel is always warned of his raids. Now, in a time before telephones, before wiretaps and spy planes and radio, you can understandably see how the king of Aram gets frustrated at this, and he begins to look around. Who's informing? Who's telling? And so he calls his trusted servants and leaders, and he begins to question them. And of course, they all blame it on Elisha. And it was Elisha, through God's power, that was able to inform Israel But it is still interesting that the first person they think of is Elisha. Why is this? It might be because a few chapters before this text, there's the Aramean commander Naaman is healed from leprosy, and so the Arameans knew Elisha was a powerful man. They would have known who he was. Or it could have been they had heard that Elisha had raised a child from the dead. Elisha had done many things. But nevertheless, they focus in on the fact that Elisha is the person who's telling their secrets. So Elisha does the exact opposite of what any sane person would do. If I were Elisha, I would have run back to Jerusalem, to the Israelite army, and I would have said, I've been doing this for you. Please get me out of this situation. But Elisha does something very, very different. He decides he's going to go to a city called Dothan. And not only that, he decides he's going to take one servant. Right? It only mentions one servant. And so, rather than going to a fortified city that's well known to be an Israelite stronghold, Elisha decides to go by himself, knowing that an entire country is after him. And he decides that he is going to go by himself, one servant. And again, this is the last thing I would do. My natural instincts would do. But an interesting thing happens when he's there. As the text says, the servant gets up and he begins he goes to the two wells. There are two wells in Dothan. That's pretty much the only thing there, and a couple of sheep herders. That's pretty much the highlight of that city. It'd be similar to going to Leonard, Texas, or Maybank, Texas, or something small. It's insignificant. So when the Arameans find out that's where he is, they take everybody. They don't take a small group to raid it. They take their army. And so the servant comes out and he looks and he sees the armies, and he, who I can sympathize with, does exactly what I would do. The first thing I would do is I'd scan the horizon and I'd say, "Can I get out of here?" And the next, and then I would go and I'd look and I'd probably get down on my knees and say some quick, get me out of these foxhole prayers that none of us have ever prayed before. And then he goes to his leader, to Elisha. And can you imagine what he thinks when he sees Elisha down on his knees? He probably thinks, Elisha's scared too. Even my leader is scared about this. So you can see that the servant was just petrified. Now Elisha takes a different perspective. Elisha goes and he offers a word of peace, and he says to the servant, "Look through the eyes of faith." He says, "Open your eyes and see God's deliverance." And so Elisha's servant opens his eyes, and he sees, rather than seeing the Aramean army, he's able to see chariots of fire and God's army all around, and he's comforted by that. Now it strikes me when I read this that, again, I sympathize with Elisha's servant. But Elisha's advice, look through the eyes of faith, I think that takes root in our lives as well, that we can use that advice. The first thing we notice, verse 15, Elisha looks, when he encourages the servant to look through the eyes of faith, we notice that the first thing that happens is the servant no longer looks at his circumstances. His eyes are shifted off of the coming army, and he's able to look at God's provision. And I think that when our circumstances come around us, the first thing that we focus on is our biggest problem. The worst thing that we do is we just figure out how am I going to escape from this army? What am I going to do? And Elisha's servant, I can imagine him praying, "God, send an army from heaven." I can imagine that was probably his prayer. I probably would have been one of my many prayers in that situation. But when we look through the eyes of faith, we're able to see past these circumstances. We're able to see God's deliverance. That God, His presence there, has provided us a way out. One of the best illustrations of looking past your circumstances comes from a very sacred movie to me, The Empire Strikes Back. And there's a story there's a scene where Luke goes to the Dagobah system to meet the Jedi Master Yoda. Hope you've seen this. If not, I shouldn't. But so he goes to the Dagobah system and he gets his ship, his X-wing, stuck in the swamp. and he can't get it out. And so he goes to Yoda, and Yoda tells him to use the Force and get it out. And Luke tries, and he tries to use his mind just to get this out, and he can't do it. And as he's walking by Yoda, he says, "You ask the impossible." And he goes and he starts sitting on a rock. And then Yoda, the little green guy, he goes over to the plane and he puts his arm out and starts straining